The nation of Israel has a secret, and literally everybody knows it. Ever since the 1960s, Jerusalem has been in possession of an arsenal of nuclear weapons, and today it's widely understood to possess dozens or even hundreds. It can deliver its nuclear arsenal by air, land, and sea. It possesses all the facilities necessary to sustain the program, and nobody in Israel is allowed to acknowledge it. For more than half a century, Israel's leaders, its military, its allies, and even its adversaries live by a common rule. Even though Israel possesses nuclear weapons, and even though the entire world is aware of that fact, Israel's official position is completely and intentionally ambiguous. For Israel, that is a very delicate balance, and a full-blown nuclear arsenal seems as if it should be the sort of secret that a nation just couldn't keep hidden for long. Yet even today, at the one-quarter century mark of the 21st century, Israel still denies its nuclear arsenal, and for some reason the strategy works. The question of why Israel acts this way, the question of how Israel gets away with it, the question of precisely what Israel's got hidden, they're all important questions to address, and by finding the answers, we can take a very close look at a nuclear program that officially just doesn't exist. The program. In the summer of 2025, open-source satellite imagery revealed the existence of a new construction project at a secretive Israeli facility known as Dimona. The nature of the construction is unknown, and at the time of writing, it hasn't been formally recognized by the Israeli government, but whatever Israel is building there, it is big, and Israel wants it really fast. The construction is so important and drew headlines from all over the world because the facility at Dimona is thought to be at the heart of Israel's secretive nuclear program. According to a range of international experts, the new construction could be anything from a brand new heavy water reactor meant to produce plutonium for use in nuclear warheads to an assembly facility to build functioning warheads or delivery devices. Whatever it is, it's clear that Israel doesn't want the world to find out any sooner than is absolutely necessary. Now we zero in on the construction at Dimona because it tells us something fundamental about Israel's suspected arsenal. There are two types of nuclear program in the world, those that are seeking to maintain their existing nuclear arsenals, like the United States and Russia, and nations that are trying to build their arsenals as fast as possible, like China. And although Israel has had its nuclear weapons since the 1960s, although Israel tries very hard to keep its program as well hidden as possible, projects like Israel's new construction at Dimona should make it entirely clear which category Israel falls into. Far from simply maintaining a pile of warheads that their grandfathers and great-grandfathers built, the people who lead Israel today maintain a vested interest in keeping Israel's program at the cutting edge. Although many of the specifics on Israel's nuclear program are functionally unknown in the public domain, the things that the world does know about the program, or at least that the world thinks it knows, paint a picture of an arsenal that you wouldn't want to mess with. Estimates on Israel's total number of nuclear warheads can vary wildly, coming in at about 90 on the low end and less than India or Pakistan, or as many as 400 on the high end, which would make Israel the world's fourth largest nuclear power after Russia, the United States, and China. Leaked emails from former US Secretary of State Colin Powell suggested in 2015 that the true number of warheads is at or near 200. Israel possesses a complete nuclear triad, combining its Jericho-3 intercontinental ballistic missile, its 5 German-made diesel-electric submarines, and the suspected launch capabilities of its F-15 and F-16 fighter jets, as well as its newer, stealthy, and heavily modified F-35s. The explosive yields of Israel's suspected warheads are unknown, but its Jericho-3 missiles are believed to be able to carry warheads of up to a 1 megaton yield, perhaps more. Bombs of that size would allow Israel to conduct electromagnetic pulse attacks, wiping out electrical and electronic systems across a targeted nation, while it's also thought to have built both smaller tactical nuclear warheads, potentially launched via artillery pieces, and nuclear landmines, which some sources suggest it deployed across the disputed Golan Heights. As for its nuclear facilities, those are dotted all over Israel, though any weapons-related purpose of those facilities is never formally acknowledged. We've already mentioned the facility at Dimona, where Israel produces plutonium and builds weapons components. A facility at Yoddefat supposedly handles weapons assembly, in duties that it shares with the Rafale defense company. Warheads, tactical nuclear artillery shells, and nuclear landmines are reportedly stored at two facilities, Tirosh and Eliabun, with Tirosh thought to store the majority of Israel's strategic high-yield devices. Finally, the Sorak Nuclear Research Center is thought to handle weapons design and related nuclear research. Since Israel doesn't reveal the existence of its program, it obviously doesn't reveal where its warheads and smaller devices are positioned at any given time, but Israel is thought to retain the constant ability to launch rapid strikes across the Middle East, while a majority of the available descriptions on where Israel's nuclear weapons are targeted would suggest that they're mostly or fully pointed toward Iran. Despite strong international suspicions around what Israel has, where its weapons are kept, and where they're aimed, Israel's leaders have worked for decades to maintain a veil of secrecy around the program. Israel's policy doesn't necessarily require its officials to deny that Israel possesses nuclear warheads, but it does require them to maintain deliberate ambiguity, and if they're going to imply an answer either way, then obviously that answer should be that no, Israel does not possess a nuclear program. As such, Israeli rhetoric is carefully calibrated to avoid giving any direct indications about what Israel does or doesn't have. The nation doesn't discuss Israel's nuclear weapons. They discuss a hypothetical nuclear option. The nation claims that Israel will not be the first nation to introduce the nuclear bomb to the Middle East, but it's not clear whether Israel means that it won't possess the bomb or that it won't detonate the bomb. Those sorts of verbal ambiguities are not necessarily fooling anybody, but that's not really the point, is it? It doesn't matter what the rest of the world thinks, as long as Israel can ensure that the rest of the world has no reason to act in a way that would threaten Israel's ability to retain its arsenal. Of course, Israeli leaders do occasionally slip up. In 2020, Benjamin Netanyahu accidentally referred to Israel as a nuclear power, which he quickly amended to, quote, energy power, while former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert nearly had to resign in 2006 after he accidentally acknowledged that Israel was a nuclear-armed nation. But gaffes aside, Israel's approach to its nuclear arsenal has been about as consistent as a deliberately ambiguous approach can be. Does Israel have nuclear weapons? Wouldn't you like to know? Bombs in the shadows. Now, the thing about Israel's hidden nuclear program is that unless the world is in for a very unexpected surprise at some point in the future, Jerusalem is the only nation in the world to treat its nuclear arsenal like this. Every other nuclear-armed nation openly acknowledges its arsenal, even North Korea, while nations that don't yet have nuclear weapons but are close enough to build them, like famously nuclear-latent Japan, willingly subject themselves to international monitoring agreements. Even the nation of Iran, which would very much like it if the world got off its back and allowed it to build a bomb, still has willfully complied with nuclear regulators at prior times in its history. Israel, though, they're a locked box. To understand why, we can start with the nuclear program's history, and a story that starts almost immediately after Israel declared its independence in 1948. At that time, an historical moment when the passage of time since the end of the Holocaust could still reasonably be counted in months, Israel's first prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, and a high proportion of Israel's new leaders believed that nuclear weapons were the single best way to ensure that a Jewish state could never be threatened with annihilation. After decades of quiet research, leaning on the support of Jewish nuclear scientists from the US, France, and elsewhere, Israel may have carried out nuclear testing of its own in the mid-1960s, as well as during the so-called Vila incident in 1979, where somebody, probably South Korea and Israel, working together, is believed to have detonated a nuclear bomb over the ocean. Israel is believed to have built operational nuclear weapons prior to the Six-Day War in 1967, when the nation very nearly detonated a warhead atop a mountain in the Sinai Peninsula as a warning to the Arab forces trying to invade, an act that was only avoided because Israel quickly won that war via conventional means. Shortly after that engagement, Israel is believed to have shifted into full-scale nuclear weapons production, but in the volatile environment of the Middle East, Israel hardly needed to give the wider Arab world a reason to accelerate their preparations for another ruinous war. Israel had also come under sustained pressure from both France and the United States, trying to dissuade Israel from making the final leap into operational status. Ultimately, owing to both international pressure and the strategic value of maintaining ambiguity, Israel never openly tested a nuclear device on its own territory and refrained from making the sorts of demonstrations that some of its leaders wanted to demonstrate to its neighbors the reason that Israel should not be challenged. In a way, Israel's nuclear secrecy has been baked into the program since its very conception, both to avoid international blowback and to ensure that the world's only Jewish nation could carefully guard the secret to its own survival. But Israel's secrecy about its nuclear program also presents a bit of a paradox. If the program is meant to be a secret, then why wouldn't Israel try a bit harder to actually hide it in the modern day? Well, earlier in this episode, we laid out all the different delivery mechanisms that Israel is expected to possess. We laid out a full list of nuclear sites that the world can see for themselves using modern satellite imagery. Israel could try harder to obscure those sites via underground facilities and other hard-to-monitor building practices, while seeding misinformation and outright disinformation until it's practically impossible to determine the truth. Instead, Israel insists that nobody can see the nuclear weapons that it may or may not have, and just clams up without bothering to actually hide away the evidence that the world can definitely see. And the answer, well, it lies in the nature of what Israel is trying to achieve and how it has to balance its unique priorities in its unique position on the world stage with the larger realities of global nuclear deterrence. On the one hand, Israel is the world's only sovereign Jewish state, officially and legally defined as such by the Israeli government. It's surrounded by nations with a deep historical animosity to the very idea of its existence, and those nations have often been ruled by despots and autocrats who've both pursued their own weapons of mass destruction and seemed unnervingly open to using them. So on that front, Israel is in the position to try and pacify the other nations of the Middle East, to convince them that there's nothing to see here, nothing to be afraid of, and certainly no reason that they should feel compelled to build their own nuclear arsenal. By denying that Israel has its arsenal, it makes it a bit easier for other Middle Eastern leaders to decide that it's not worth the expenditure or the international controversy to build their own. But on the other hand, Israel has its nuclear weapons for the same reason that every other nuclear-armed nation has them, to try and make it unthinkable for another nation to attack under any circumstance. We've explained the core premise of strategic deterrence, nuclear or otherwise, on our sister channel Warfriends, but for those who may not be familiar, deterrence is the principle that by building the required means to inflict harm upon an enemy and then making sure that enemy is aware of your ability to inflict harm, you can convince your enemy that it isn't worth the potential costs of trying to attack you. But in order for deterrence to work, you've got to make sure that your adversary knows what you can do to them. If somebody's trying to corner me and attack me in a dark alley and I've got a big heavy stick, then sure, I can keep the stick secret until the last possible moment. I can bludgeon the living hell out of them and make them regret trying to hurt me. But if I show them my heavy stick before they can get close, then I've got a very good chance at stopping the fight from ever happening at all. For that same reason, Israel's nuclear deterrent only works if its adversaries are at least pretty sure that Israel possesses nuclear warheads. They don't have to know with absolute certainty, and they don't need to know the details of how Israel might use its weapons or what its weapons are truly capable of. But they've got to know enough to be afraid, and in Israel's case, they've also got to not quite know enough that they'd feel compelled to build nuclear weapons themselves. It's in that careful balance that we find our way to Israel's decision to keep its warheads a secret. And for Israel, the importance of a nuclear deterrent is even greater than it should be in other nuclear-armed nations. The United States, for example, doesn't have very much to fear from a conventional military attack by any of its real-world adversaries. In fact, it could probably hold off a conventional attack on its own soil from the entire world combined without ever having to resort to nuclear weapons. Britain and France are separated from Russia by the NATO alliance. None of Russia's immediate neighbors, except the whole of NATO, would require the use of nuclear warheads. China has a vested interest in not getting into any wars. North Korea is much more interested in using its warheads as a threat than as a weapon, and Pakistan and India are so convinced that they'll nuke each other into oblivion during a full-scale war that they'll go to great lengths to avoid that possibility. But if Israel comes under threat of attack from its Middle Eastern neighbors, specifically a region-wide attack like Israel's wars of the 20th century, then Israel does not have the ability to conventionally defend itself. It can inflict incredible harm onto its adversaries and deter them from attacking at all, but if they chose to commit an all-out attack at any cost, then Israel would be at risk of practically immediate collapse. Israel is tiny. It lacks any kind of strategic depth to sustain a defense of its homeland, and for that reason, it just doesn't have the option to retreat from the front-line positions without immediately being backed up into Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. Its options are to either mount an all-out defense of its territory, where any victory would have to come at incredible cost, or it can convince its potential wartime adversaries never to attack at all. That's why Israel's nuclear deterrent is so important to the nation, and why the rest of the Middle East needs to know about it, even if Israel refuses to acknowledge it directly. Their awareness of Israel's arsenal is the ultimate insurance policy against invasion, and it is an insurance policy that Israel cannot live without. Now, next up, we're going to go geopolitical on Israel's nuclear program, but before we do, we've got to ask another big question of you. Do you enjoy what we do here at Political Fronts? Do you want more episodes, more analysis, deeper insights into the stories that are shaping our world? Do you crave these kinds of stories at the intersection of grand strategy, global conflict, and geopolitics? Well, that's why our team has recently unveiled Fronts.co, our brand spanking new website designed to provide you with exactly that. Our writers of Political Fronts and our sister channel War Fronts gather together at Fronts.co to take an even closer look at the political movements, the leaders, and the policies that define this moment in history. Every week, we release 2 exclusive video episodes that can't be found anywhere else, including our briefing room, a regular roundup of underreported stories that deserve your attention. Also on Fronts.co, we publish 2 expert articles every week drawing on journalists and analysts who've chosen to share their insights with our audience and the wider world. One recent article explored a topic similar to this one on the future of Taiwan's civil nuclear program by award-winning journalist Alexander Kaufman. You'll also get access to our free twice-weekly newsletter, our brand new subreddit, r/Frontsco, and inside access to behind-the-scenes content, unreleased episodes, new merch offerings, and more. A subscription is just $5 a month or $50 a year, and it helps us to grow our free offerings here as well on War Fronts and Political Fronts. So, if you want to support this channel and get a ton of good content in return, head to Fronts.co. We'll pop a link in the description as well, but it's easy. It's Fronts.co, not .com. I couldn't afford the .com. Someone had it. This was expensive enough. Nuclear Israel in the modern era. Modern Israel has given no indication that it would ever acknowledge its nuclear program outright, despite the stresses and challenges of the 2020s. Over the course of the last 2 years or so, the world has watched as Israeli civilians were massacred in the October 7th attacks, as Hezbollah and Yemen's Houthi rebels did their best to inflict pain upon the Israeli state, and as Israel and its arch-rival Iran engaged in a full-scale open military conflict for the very first time in history. Even as Israel has insisted that Iran is on the cusp of developing its own nuclear warheads, Israel has showed no desire to reveal its own. Not by way of a test, not by way of a formal acknowledgement, and not even by way of a carefully manicured leak that would allow it to maintain some plausible deniability. But that doesn't mean that Israel has let its nuclear program lapse or risk falling into disrepair. As we've mentioned, Israel appears to be hard at work expanding its facilities at Dimona, and there have been no indications that Israel's secretive work on its nuclear arsenal has slowed down. The Israeli public remains in support of both Israel's secret nuclear weapons program and the decision to keep it a secret. Right now, Jerusalem faces no real domestic pressure to acknowledge the existence of its arsenal, and even less to have to consider the idea of denuclearization. For modern Israel, that just ain't on the cards. Instead, Israel chooses to focus its attention on deterrence, and specifically on the question of how Israel would use a set of hypothetical nuclear warheads if indeed Israel ever possessed such a thing. That deterrent effect is rooted in 2 key concepts: the Begin Doctrine and the Samson option. The Begin Doctrine dictates Israel's posture on preventative strikes, not using their own nuclear weapons, but to ensure that their adversaries cannot develop weapons of mass destruction of any kind, especially nuclear ones. Israel has openly acknowledged the doctrine as a matter of principle and has vowed openly that it will never allow Israel's current or future adversaries to develop WMDs of their own. Balancing out the Begin Doctrine is the so-called Samson option, an idea that Israel prefers to be whispered about in the halls and chambers of Tehran instead of advertised by Israeli politicians in the global press. Under the Samson option, first conceived in the mid-1960s, Israel's nuclear doctrine calls for a massive, all-out retaliation against its enemies using nuclear weapons in the event that an adversary is successfully in the process of invading or destroying Israel. Under Israel's doctrine, the nation would respond to such an overwhelming attack by launching an all-out attack of its own, ensuring that if Israel is going down, then the people who chose to destroy Israel are going down with it. Between those 2 guiding principles, it's the Begin Doctrine that's gotten much more of a workout on the international stage. Israel's worst-case scenario is that some nation across the Arab world would unveil its own nuclear weapons, which would fundamentally change the balance of power across the region. Israel already won the Middle East's nuclear arms race and did it decisively. But if another nation were to reveal a nuclear arsenal, then that would set off a proliferation race. For one thing, Israel would almost certainly have to formally reveal its own nuclear weapons in order to maintain the value of its deterrent, and it would need to signal the sheer size of its arsenal in order to reinforce the idea that some other Middle Eastern nations shouldn't even take the risk of trying to catch up. For another, the combination of Israel formally acknowledging its nuclear arsenal and another Middle Eastern nation also revealing its arsenal would place pressure on the rest of the region to start building nuclear warheads as soon as possible. In the Middle East, the nations of Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Turkey would all immediately feel pressure to develop a warhead if one of the others did, and if Israel acknowledged the same. If any of those nations developed a warhead, then nations like the Emirates, Egypt, or other powers across the Arab world might be forced to consider their own initiatives. That's a situation that would quickly spiral out of control, where the use of a nuclear weapon somewhere in the Middle East would immediately become more likely, and if anyone uses a warhead in a tinderbox like that, then everyone is going to use whatever they've got. So in the modern day, Israel and its foreign intelligence service Mossad work overtime to ensure that such a catastrophe could never happen. Back in the 70s and 80s, Israel carried out airstrikes and suspected assassination against members of Saddam Hussein's nuclear program in Iraq and planned a joint attack against Pakistan alongside India, although that never took place. In the 2000s and 2010s, Israel took action against suspected nuclear facilities in both Syria and Iran, while Iran in particular has faced a withering and constant assault on its nuclear ambitions from Israel and its allies. As grim as it may sound, Israel has made the assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists into an art form. Its backers in the United States have developed and deployed revolutionary tools like the Stuxnet computer worm to disrupt its facilities. And finally, in 2025, both Israel and the United States engaged in a series of devastating attacks against Iranian nuclear sites, setting back the nation's nuclear program substantially, although it appears that the program was not entirely destroyed. For Israel, it's of paramount importance that the nation builds, maintains, upgrades, and expands its secretive nuclear arsenal. But it's just as important that Israel keeps its place at the top of the mountain, at least relative to its potential adversaries across the Middle East. Israel's nuclear program is technically a secret, albeit a poorly kept one, because that strategic ambiguity helps Israel to keep a tenuous balance across the region. Whether Israel's neighbors enjoy that balance is a very different question, and certainly Israel's relentless campaign against other nations' WMD programs doesn't make Jerusalem any friends. But if Israel is the only nation in the Middle East to possess nuclear weapons, then it doesn't have to give a damn what its neighbors think of its arsenal. By Israel's own logic, every day that it possesses both the power and the secrecy of its nuclear materials is another day that Israel knows it'll see tomorrow. And in Jerusalem, it's pretty much all that matters. Thank you for watching.